Remember when Canadians told each other to give her before any challenge? Or called the smartest kid in class a keener? These distinctly Canadian sayings have quietly disappeared from our vocabulary, replaced by global slang and American terms. But what does losing these linguistic treasures reveal about our changing national identity? Coming in at number 8 on our countdown of forgotten Canadian sayings, Giver captured our national spirit of determination and all out effort. Back in the early 2000s, this phrase echoed across ski hills, hockey rinks, and job sites, a distinctly Canadian call to action. You'd hear it before someone attempted a particularly daring jump at the lake, or when friends encouraged each other to push through the final kilometer of a tough hike. The phrase truly entered Canadian pop culture royalty with the 2002 cult classic Few Beer, where Terry and Dean's headbanging adventures cemented giver in our collective vocabulary. For a decade, it was impossible to witness any feat of Canadian determination without someone shouting this two-syllable encouragement. Yet somehow, this perfect encapsulation of our send it spirit has gradually faded from everyday speech, reserved now mostly for nostalgic Canadians who remember its heyday. At number 7, we have keener, that uniquely Canadian word for the enthusiastic student who always had their hand up first. Throughout the 80s and 90s, classrooms across the country knew exactly who the keeners were. First to arrive, homework always complete, and disappointingly excited about pop quizzes. What made Keener special wasn't just its meaning, but how it carried a uniquely Canadian blend of light mockery and subtle admiration. Unlike harsher American equivalents, being called a Keener came with a grudging respect for the dedication, even if you'd never admit it. You can still occasionally hear this term in university lecture halls, but it's becoming increasingly rare as younger Canadian students adopt more globally recognized slang. If you're enjoying this journey through Canada's linguistic past, make sure to join our community by subscribing. We're exploring all the forgotten gems of Canadian culture every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Number 6 brings us to skookum, a word with deep roots in the Pacific Northwest that once peppered conversations throughout British Columbia. Originating from Chinook jargon, a trade language used among indigenous peoples and European settlers, skookum conveyed that something was excellent, strong, or reliable. In the timber camps of Vancouver Island during the 1950s and 60s, having skookum equipment could mean the difference between life and death. The word carried the scent of freshly cut cedar, the sound of axes striking wood, and the security of knowing your gear wouldn't fail when you needed it most. Older British Columbians still remember when a skookum house meant solid construction that could withstand coastal storms, or how the highest praise for home-cooked salmon was simply declaring it skookum. The term survived well into the 1970s before beginning its slow retreat from common usage, though you'll still hear it occasionally in small coastal communities where linguistic traditions die hard. At number 5, the maritime expression, fill your boots, invites us into the generous spirit of Atlantic Canada. Born in fishing communities where abundance was celebrated and shared, this phrase became the quintessential East Coast invitation to help yourself, whether to food, drink, or opportunity. Picture crowded Halifax pubs in the 1960s, warm with bodies and conversation, where fill your boots would echo over the sounds of fiddles and stomping feet. The phrase carried the salty tang of ocean air, the comfort of kitchen parties where no one went hungry, and the unspoken understanding that communities survived by looking after each other. What made this saying special was how it transformed necessity into virtue. In harsh coastal environments where tomorrow's catch was never guaranteed, today's abundance was meant to be shared completely. You'd hear it from grandmothers urging second helpings of fish chowder, from uncles offering young nephews their first beer, and from neighbors with surplus garden vegetables. Yet this perfect expression of maritime generosity has gradually disappeared from everyday conversation, preserved mainly in heritage festivals and nostalgic conversations among older Atlantic Canadians. Our number 4 spot goes to the uniquely Canadian driving directions hang a Larry or hang a Roger, phrases that guided countless family road trips before GPS changed navigation forever. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, these colorful instructions for turning left or right echoed through station wagons and sedans across Canadian highways and city streets. There was something distinctly playful about these terms, transforming mundane directions into characters, Larry and Roger, who became invisible companions on every journey. The terms carried the crackling static of AM radio weather reports, the rustling of paper maps unfolded across dashboards, and the particular tension of a parent navigating unfamiliar neighborhoods, while children squabbled in the back seat. Unlike their straightforward American counterparts, these phrases reflected the Canadian tendency to soften commands with personality and humor. Many Canadians now in their 40s can still hear their father's voice saying, "We'll hang a Larry at the next lights, then it's 2 more blocks to Grandma's." The instruction embedded in memories of anticipation and arrival. The decline of these phrases paralleled the rise of electronic navigation, first with MapQuest printouts, then GPS units, and finally smartphone apps that speak in standardized algorithmic instructions. The technology that made navigation easier also homogenized how we speak about moving through our environment, erasing regional quirks like Larry and Roger from our linguistic landscape. At number 3, we have the distinctly Canadian homo milk, a term that raised eyebrows for visitors but was completely innocent to generations of Canadians. This abbreviated label for homogenized milk was standard on grocery shelves and refrigerators nationwide for decades. The phrase evokes the satisfying weight of glass bottles delivered to front porches before dawn, the distinctive red lettering on cardboard cartons, and the specific sound of aluminum bottle caps popping off under eager thumbs. Homo milk was embedded in the rhythm of Canadian domestic life, poured over morning cereal, stirred into coffee, and used in countless family recipes passed through generations. Its cultural significance went beyond mere dairy. It represented the standardization of Canadian food systems in the mid-20th century, when consistent 3.25% milk fat became the household norm from Victoria to St. John's. Parents would send children to corner stores with instructions to pick up a quart of homo milk, a phrase uttered without a second thought. Yet, as social awareness evolved through the 1990s and 2000s, the innocent abbreviation became increasingly awkward, eventually disappearing from packaging and conversation alike. Today's Canadian children would never use this once ubiquitous term, and many would be bewildered to learn it was ever standard vocabulary, representing a fascinating example of how language adapts to changing social contexts, even when the product itself remains unchanged. Our runner up at number 2 is the proudly Canadian pronunciation Z for the letter Z, a linguistic marker that distinguished Canadian English from American English throughout the 20th century. This single syllable carried the weight of British colonial influence, educational tradition, and quiet resistance to American cultural dominance. For generations of Canadian schoolchildren, the alphabet song concluded not with Y and Z, but with Y and Z, creating a distinctive cadence that marked Canadian classrooms from coast to coast. The pronunciation evokes the scratch of chalk on blackboards, the sing-song voices of primary school students, and the gentle corrections of teachers reinforcing this aspect of Canadian identity. What made Z particularly significant wasn't just its sound, but what it represented. A deliberate preservation of linguistic heritage that differentiated Canadians from our southern neighbors despite overwhelming media influence. Parents and grandparents would pointedly correct children who came home from watching American television, pronouncing it Z, a small but meaningful act of cultural preservation. Yet, despite this tradition, Z has been fighting a losing battle against Z for decades, with younger Canadians increasingly adopting the American pronunciation. Each Z that replaces a Z represents another small surrender in Canada's ongoing negotiation between cultural sovereignty and continental integration. a single syllable that speaks volumes about national identity in the face of globalization. And our number one forgotten Canadian saying that once defined our culture: keep your stick on the ice. This hockey metaphor transcended sports to become life advice passed between generations of Canadians, embodying our national values of preparation, readiness, and quiet determination. While many associate it with Steve Smith's character Red Green and his handyman's philosophy, the phrase had already been circulating on community rinks and frozen ponds for decades before finding television fame. It carried the distinct hollow sound of skates cutting fresh ice, the warmth of arena coffee cupped in mittened hands, and the particular silence of early morning practices when breath hung visible in the cold air. What elevated this saying beyond mere sports instruction was how perfectly it encapsulated the Canadian approach to life's challenges. Stay ready, maintain control, and position yourself for opportunity without showboating. Fathers would offer it as parting advice to children heading out for job interviews or first dates. Coaches would mutter it before crucial third periods, and friends would remind each other during difficult times, always with the understanding that it meant more than hockey. It spoke to a particularly Canadian stoicism, a belief that proper preparation and steady presence would see you through life's challenges better than flashy displays or emotional outbursts. Though rarely heard in daily conversation now, keep your stick on the ice remains perhaps the purest distillation of Canadian practical wisdom. A reminder of who we were and perhaps still are beneath the surface changes in our vocabulary. Though many of these sayings have faded from daily use, they remain echoes of a shared Canadian experience, linguistic touchstones that bring a smile of recognition to those who remember them. In their collective loss, we can trace the outline of a changing national identity, increasingly connected to global culture, but perhaps at the cost of the distinctive expressions that once marked our speech as uniquely Canadian. Maybe it's time we gave R another chance, filled our boots with these old sayings, and kept our sticks on the ice of linguistic heritage. After all, you don't have to be a keener to appreciate what these skookum phrases tell us about where we came from and who we still are.